Greetings, I'm Andy Johnson. This presentation is called Understanding Reading, Understanding Evidence and Research. I have a lot of notes and handouts and other things related to this at my free Substack. Plug in the Reading Instruction Show and you will find it there. It's free, there's no subscription charge. Also, a lot of people have asked me about teaching writing, and writing instruction is one of the most under instructed skills in our schools. Again, another free Substack, How to Teach Writing. You can find it there. All the stuff there is based on my book. And of course, like the rest of 90% of America, I have a podcast with tens of listeners. Okay, let's start. Context matters to understand things, to understand research, to understand data, to understand evidence. Context matters. You can't pull things out of context and try to understand. So let us look at the big picture. The big picture is to enable all children to develop their full literacy potential so that they can use literacy for real life purposes in the real world, not to pass a unit test or to get higher scores on this and that. So to use literacy to achieve real life goals, and literacy includes reading and writing, but also speaking, listening, and thinking. So I ask unto you, what constitutes evidence of this? Beware of the number monkeys who try to describe learning only in terms of numbers. If it can't be quantified, they tell us it doesn't exist. Reading is not sounding out words, it's creating meaning with print, and we read for two purposes. We read to understand information, and we read to enjoy books. That is the end state, the goal. All our objectives should lead to that goal. Everything we do to teach reading should lead to those two goals. And the ability to do these things should define students' reading ability. So what is evidence of a literacy crisis? We're talking about evidence. The crisis, a crisis, any crisis, is a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. And some insist we have this thing called a reading crisis. You can read the media and literacy. Thousands of children functionally illiterate. Oh, really? Just because you see it or hear it doesn't mean it's true. Teachers criticize their colleges of ed for not preparing them to teach reading. How many teachers? 2 teachers? 4 teachers? How old were they? First year, 20th year, 50th year? How many colleges of ed? We must look for evidence as we consume the media, as we consume various forms of media. It's alarming, they tell us. Children are severely behind, teachers say. Behind what? Behind who? What educators are saying what? Just because, is it 2 educators saying it? Journalists are important in a democratic society. I'm not getting down on them, but journalists write stories. Stories are not evidence. Stories are things that people put together, not necessarily for accuracy, but for impact, to get clicks on their little websites, to get awards at banquets. That's what journalists do. There is not legitimate evidence that there is a literacy crisis. Evidence, legitimate. Paul Thomas talks about it, has written about all the various literacy crises starting in the early 50s. And there'll be another one coming around in 10 to 15 years when this one is found to be another boondoggle, or when some publisher needs something else to be sold. There will be another one when they find this science of reading thing doesn't work. Why? Because it's much easier to blame schools and teachers and parents than to address social issues, systemic poverty, economic inequality, overcrowded schools, income inequality, lack of school funding. These things impact learning. But it's easier to say schools are failing, teachers are doing a bad job. Everybody who's been to first grade seems to have all the answers to fix public education. Teach more phonics, George Bush told us once. Higher standards, get tough. Get rid of teachers' unions. Reward the good teachers. More tests. Reward high-performing schools. Interesting. Simple answers to complex problems. Blaming teachers takes people's attention from the real issues, and teachers can't fight back. This has led to a teacher shortage. Teacher turnover is the leading factor in teacher shortages. They are leaving. Qualified teachers are leaving. Teachers who love their job, good teachers, for reasons other than retirement. There's no shortage of teachers. There's a shortage of teachers who are willing to put up with baloney. As an example, I am retiring in 3 months, and one of the reasons I'm retiring is because I would be required to go through letters training, what I call re-education camp. Just like in A Clockwork Orange, they forced that guy's eyes open to watch those scenes, I would be forced to watch letters or to take letters training. There is not a reading crisis, a reading achievement crisis. Now, we are going to look at data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is part of the U.S. Department of Education. They take a large sample, a representative sample. They give tests to students in grades 4, 8, and 12 every year. It's called the Nation's Report Card. It gives us a sense of how we are doing. Reeking Ruby and Risco. There's no irrefutable evidence that we are experiencing a national literacy crisis. A crisis would look something like that, or something like that. It would not look like that. These are long-term reading scores in 4th grade and in 8th grade, starting in 71. You can see there's just a gradual release of scores, but there's a natural fluctuation, and that's called normal. This is the latest one I found a couple days ago on the website, and it's hard to find this data. They've included a whole bunch of stuff that makes it difficult. No statistically significant difference from 2013 to 2020. Of course, we had the COVID dip, didn't we? And before the dip, we were higher than we were, statistically significantly higher than we were in 92. Same with 8th grade. Here is the COVID dip, boop, and we expected that. But from 12 to 20, no significant dip. Reading scores fall to new lows, says Sarah Schwartz from Education Week. And she's a reporter. She just writes a lot of stuff. She is a reporter. She's not an academician or a scholarly writer. But here's the thing, even if she weren't lying, think about it. This is the dates when all the states have passed their miracle reading legislation. Mississippi in 2013, here's when the miracle started. And look at all these other things, all these other miracles starting 2009, 21, 22. Here's Minnesota right there in 2023. So let the miracles occur. We should just be sitting back, enjoying our cup of coffee and just watching the miracles unfold in front of us. dramatic pause, except they are not. But even if there were a crisis, which there is not, the science of reading fellows, people, have claimed that they've isolated the causal variable. They say that they know both the cause and the solution to a problem that does not exist. But let me tell you, my friends, randomly determining causality is not science. That's baloney, sometimes called pseudoscience. These are all the variables that impact student achievement. And you can pause and look at it yourself for a good time on a Saturday afternoon. Again, we must distinguish between scholarly articles, scholarship, and journalists. Journalists write down what people tell them. People tell them things, they write it down, and they create their stories. And everyone wants to be the next Emily Hanford. Look how famous she is and how much money she's getting and how many speaking gigs. Oh, I want to be just like Emily. So they publish stuff. They put numbers to it. They have sensational things. They always have a picture of a kid who's crying or looking distraught, and look at this graph. Oh, that's just horrible. That's horrible. Pulling things out of context, putting them in ways that create a sensation. It's a straw man argument. This is when you create a cartoonish version of something and argue against the cartoon. Things like balanced literacy. People describe it in ways that it is simply not true. Whole language, the 3 queuing systems. Some people are just horribly upset about what they call queuing, and they don't even know what it is. They're describing something horrible. Public schools, DEI has been made a swearing word. Critical race theory, same thing, that by people that have not taken the time to understand what it is. I had this fellow on my show. I was interviewing him. He asked me to, so I did. He had a book which had a very interesting premise. The book was called Failure Factor. And in this book, he described administration as changing teachers' grades to show that they were doing a good job. And in Baltimore, apparently, instead of a superintendent, they have a CEO, hence the factory motif. But Brother Chris here has some very simplistic answers to a very complex situation, and he either misunderstood or misrepresented information. His answer, of course, was just to hold students to higher standards. Oh, okay, just hold them to higher standards. Duh, why didn't I think of that? Based on a lot of I thinkisms. Now, notice here's some of the stuff from his book indicating failure. He says, well, the budget has stayed consistent, all right, and the number of enrollment has gone down significantly. Look at all these things. But none of these things are indicative of the quality of education occurring in classrooms. SAT, that's a self-selected test that people going to college take. That's not a representation of how schools are doing. AP, advanced placement exams, again, a representative sample. Attendance, you could have quality teaching going on, but that does not impact attendance or dropout or absenteeism or enrollment. Some of these are societal factors. So either he doesn't know, he doesn't understand, or he's purposely misrepresenting to get his little statues and to get book sales. Again, he said, more discipline, hold students to higher standards, get rid of teachers' unions. I hear that a lot. And in my book, I'll be talking about teachers' unions at some point, not today. Here's the thing I read in his book that made me want to throw up in my mouth. When a reporter focuses on one beat, they become an expert on that beat. Oftentimes, a beat reporter knows the subject matter better than the industry professional they cover, unquote. What do you say to something like that? You don't. You just vomit in your mouth a little bit. They write stories. This is a story written like a detective novel. Much of the city has fallen into a state of decay, and that was certainly my view one September afternoon in 2017, as my photographer and I were. You get the idea. This isn't scholarly writing, not that you need scholarly writing, but he's creating a story for impact. That's what they do in television. That's how you get those little statues at award ceremonies. Everyone wants a statue. I want a statue. I welcome journalists into our academic conversations. I welcome you, but you do not get a free pass on ignorance. In my conversation with Chris and John Stossel, I understood that you have to have some background knowledge to understand and interpret what you see and hear. I often had to correct the presumption upon which questions were based before I answered questions. They had a shallow and disjointed knowledge base. There's nothing wrong with that. But you don't realize that. It makes it difficult to engage in academic discourse with these people, with journalists sometimes. I don't want to generalize. Reading instruction is first and foremost an academic topic, and it has been discussion has been going on in academic discussions for decades. And there's always been people with differing ideas. There isn't a reading war. And again, you are welcome, as anybody is, into our academic discussion. Anybody can publish in an academic journal. It's subjected to blind peer review. Anybody could speak at a conference, but allow for questions, get alternative views. When you say research, cite the research. You should not get a pass on ignorance, and that is happening. As I mentioned, I was interviewed by John Stossel. The interview took about 60 minutes. He put together a story, and my little part, I'm guessing, was 2 to 4 minutes at most, and he created a collage with it to create the story that he wanted. This is an email I got from a producer. We're doing a story on the literacy crisis in America, of which there is not. I came across your advocacy of whole word reading instruction. Where did you come up with that? I don't know. Do you know what whole word reading instruction is? I've talked about whole language, but that's different from whole word. But anyway, he said, we would like to get your take on the subject. They would like to get my take. Imagine that. They didn't want my take on anything. They wanted to create a collage. Now, the speaking fee for John Stossel, for him to do a keynote, is $75,000. I know because I pretended I was someone else and I contacted his speaking bureau. Am I a bad man for doing that? The speaking fee for me to do a keynote is give me a little flattery and a hamburger, and I will be there. Now, in 1992, somebody determined that the NAEP reading scores weren't low enough, so we need to invent categories: advanced, proficient, and basic. Well, what is basic? We just assume that it's something. What is proficient? We just assume that it's something. What's average? This is what Rinkin, Ruby, and Risco said. The cut scores used to define these categories were arbitrarily set by a small group of hand-picked, politically appointed experts against the recommendations of the psychometricians who had been contracted to advise the development of this approach. You hired people? Interesting. Okay, interesting. Categories and levels and content are arbitrarily defined, citing some more sources there. Now, if you go on the website, U.S. Department of Education, they report in percentile rankings, 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and they have so much data and little data bits. It's designed more to confuse and you can pull out little data bits to create a variety of stories, a variety of impressions. If you do this, pull it out of context. Context is needed. This is average right here. So let me explain. 1992, this is average. So they decided, I think we'll make basic a little below average and proficient a little above average. What would that look like in a normal population? In a normal population, we have the bell-shaped curve where 50% are below the mean and 50% are above the mean. And in every school, we are going, if it's a normal population, we're going to have 50% below the mean or below average. Well, if they decide that this is basic right here, by definition, 40% are going to be below the basic level. And 60% are going to be below the proficient level. And you can say, oh, we have a crisis. Only 40% of our students are reading at the proficient level. You see how the game is played? That's how they play the game. That's not right. 8th grade, same thing. Same thing. Same thing. That's not right. Walton said, this is from their website. This is from the Center for Educational Statistics. Proficiency levels are based on desired expectation. These levels are aspirational, not mathematical. We would like this to be basic. We would like this. They're to be used on a trial basis. We need evidence to determine if they are reasonable, valid, and informative. Hand-picked political appointees, arbitrarily decided levels. Anytime you hear about NAEP levels of basic and proficient, even on state level tests, these should always be put in this context, and they should always be questioned. State criterion reference test. You can't compare state to state because each state has a different test, but someone establishes a criterion. We think 3rd graders should know that, and 6th graders should know that. A test is given every year, and we think this is basic and that is okay. Arbitrarily decide. Who decides the criteria? Who decides the content of these tests? Who decides what's advanced, proficient, and basic? And how are these decisions made? I had to do a lot of looking here in Minnesota on their websites. And I finally found, after a lot of phone calls and tiny print on their websites, that originally these MCAs were based on the Common Core state standards. They took these 3-dimensional standards and made a 2-dimensional test. Of course, you never actually get to see what's on the test. And in your real life, how often have you had to do these things? But yet these are used to define the literacy potential of our students. These standards, Common Core, were aspirational, not mathematical. To prepare students, we would like them to be able to do these things at each level. Aspirational. And this idea, like they have here in Minnesota, that every student will be reading at grade level, that's simply absurd. That creates winners and losers. Grade level. How do you determine grade level? Criterion-based, norm reference-based, aspirational, inspirational, fairy tale-based measures. Now in Minnesota, a couple years back, they claimed that test scores were falling, but no test scores were ever reported. They don't give you that. They simply give you percentages in 4 of these arbitrarily defined categories. Those aren't test scores. And you can't use percentages to make comparison. This is percentages of students at or above proficiency. That's not a comparison of scores over time. That's what's called in the business baloney, and that's the family-friendly term for it. So tips for evaluating scholarly work. And again, academic discourse is when you use research and reason to make a case for one's argument. Argument here isn't the yelling kind of argument. It's where you put forth a proposition and you make a case for that using reason and research. And disagreement is a natural part of the academic conversation. It's how we evolve our thinking. There should never be a singular type of thinking, this insulated bubble that the Reading League tries to create for itself, that creates cognitive inbreeding and deleterious mutations. We need to hear other ideas to evolve our thinking. I say the Reading League because when I post things on their various platforms, they block me. Oh, we can't have our people hearing that idea. That's horrible. They may believe the wrong thing. So they block me. Interesting. Now, it's important that we critique each other's work. That's what we do in a scholarly, in academia, in a scholarly context. Now, I have a book coming out this summer, the one you see here, and I hope you critique it. I hope you tell me what I got wrong. Don't tell me I'm a bad person or I'm a horrible person. I already know that. Don't tell me I'm not very smart. I already know that. Tell me what you disagree with and what I got wrong. And here's the thing. If you tell me what I get wrong and I'm convinced, I will make another video. But don't just say I'm a bad person and I got it wrong. That's not academic discourse. Disagreements based on works published or presented in an academic context. That's what academic discourse is. Not on personal attributes, not on personal emails. This is where we disagree. We must have disagreement. That's how we evolve our thinking. Academic discourse using reason and research-based theories. And by the way, there never was a reading war. That was a term invented by people outside of an academic context in the media to sell books or papers, whatever. There has always been differing ideas for decades since the National Council of Teachers of English was formed in 1911. The International Literacy Association, then the International Reading Association in 1956. People have differing ideas based on their theoretical orientations. Academic discourse is how we hold ourselves accountable. And I've taken Sally Shaywitz to terms for her research, for her bad research, but I'm sure she's a wonderful human being and she has to be very smart. But I have trouble with all the flaws and confounding variables in her research. How does she get away with that, I wonder? The differences we have in academia are based on theoretical orientations. Every theory can be supported by research data and evidence. Theories are neither right nor wrong. They're weak or robust, and I'll demonstrate that. Flat Earth, that's a theory. There may be little bits of data. It's a very, very weak theory. And I think the simple view of reading is the flat Earth theory of reading. Yes, there's research to support it, but it's weak research. It's a weak theory. Theories are based on research. Each research study is a data dot. That's why you can have different research-based theory connecting different data dots differently, and they're both research-based. It's weak or robust theory. A robust theory connects a lot of data dots. A weak theory leaves a lot of data unaccounted for. The interactive theory of reading, psycholinguistic, neurocognitive theories account for a lot of data dots. The simple view of reading account for a few. They ignore a whole bunch of stuff. Now, here's one way to transform weak into robust theories. You can do what the National Reading Panel did. They ignored or excluded a whole bunch of research. Oh, all that research over there, that's not good stuff. We're only this kind of research is good. Okay. Reading instruction is an academic topic. Academic arguments based on theoretical differences have been going on for years. It's a natural part. And as I said, the term reading wars was invented by the media. All right, let's take a look at scholars. We are looking at evidence. Scholars should not get a free pass on obfuscation. Common tricks using buzzwords. That's a word used to elicit an emotional response rather than accurately transmit information. And using them in an academic context, that's an academic buzzword used to create the illusion of something important. Now, take a look at these academic buzzwords. They're used all the time to make something sound very, very important. Could you define each one of these? If I went to a reading league conference and sat down and have each person write a definition of these, how much similarity do you think there would be in these? What is evidence-based instruction? Well, it's instruction and it's based on evidence. Okay, buzzword. And we already talked about the straw man argument. Louisa Moats. Oh, Louisa. She wrote this for the Thomas Fordham Institutes, not peer-reviewed. But here's the ultimate straw person talking about whole language. Uses teacher modeling, not direct instruction. Instead of teaching children how to read and comprehend, they engage in shared reading. Students can repeat the language and read by osmosis or memorization. Louisa, do you not know better? That is not at all what whole language is. Do you not know better, or do you know better and you're doing this anyway? Both are frightening propositions, but this is a straw man argument. This is a cartoonish version of something. You have no decency. Don't do that. Baloney is interpreting research or misrepresenting decontextualized data. And as an example, this is why we have to critically evaluate all the scholarly work. We can't be snookered by important sounding brain words. We have to pull them apart. We have to examine the propositions and the citations. And a cow pie is when you put a whole bunch of academic buzzwords together to create a conveniently inaccurate perception of something. Now, here's an example of a cow pie. Goldenberg wrote this in Reading Research Quarterly, talking about reading wars. Now, a proposition is a basic claim or assertion within a sentence. You can say it's true or false. The dog is in the house. 3 propositions. There's a dog. The dog is in something, and it is the house in which the dog is in. 3 propositions there. Okay. Here's Goldenberg's abstract. The author's intent is to begin with the knowledge base of the science of reading, build onto it research on effective literacy instruction for ELs, and then begin articulating what could become a science of reading instruction for students who are learning and progressing as readers in English while learning to speak and understand. It sounds very good. It sounds so wonderful. But when we look at that cow pie, we can find here's just 2 of the propositions. There is a knowledge base, and the science of reading has it. The science of reading knowledge base. Where is that? Where can I find that? Who put the knowledge in the base? Is there a balanced literacy knowledge base? These are buzzwords strung together. I could do that. The presenter's intent in this presentation is to begin with the knowledge base of reading research, build onto it research related to neuroscience, psycholinguistics. You get the idea. Anyone can create a cow pie. It's not that tough. It creates the illusion of stuff, but it doesn't transmit information. We have to be wary when we see things like this. This is a misinterpretation. This is an example of baloney. In that paper, he referenced 2 research studies to make a case for structured reading instruction, and this is what he said. He looked at Vaughan et al. And Erie et al.'s research studies. They included explicit and systematic instruction of targeted knowledge and skills and daily lessons that include activities focused on the 5 core skills of phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, and comprehension, developing oral language, integrated oral language. It sounds very good. Stop using my cow pies, the cow says. But when we look at that, and I just so happened to look at each of these studies, and I've happened to analyze both of them very carefully. These are the pretty words that Claude Goldenberg uses. Oh, they are so pretty words, but they are conveniently inaccurate because in his description, none of these words were supported by the research he is citing. Yes, some of them were used as descriptors in the studies. Their description was often inaccurate, incomplete, or just plain wrong. But none of the pretty words were variables that were isolated and compared in these 2 studies. Why is that important? And here's more baloney. Effects were moderate, measures on English phonological awareness, etc. Okay. Principles of early reading instruction. Okay. Isolating variables in controlled experimental research, which is the science of reading research standards. That's not mine. It's used to determine if one thing caused the other thing to occur. If structured language causes something to occur, but you have to start with 2 groups that are similar and exposed to similar conditions. The treatment is the variable. That's the only difference that should be between the 2 groups. And if there is a difference on some measure between the 2 groups at the end, and if that difference is statistically significant, we can say with some amount of confidence that the treatment was the cause of the variable. That's a very simple overview of controlled experimental research. But in both the studies that Goldenberg is citing so confidently, they compared students who received individual tutoring to students who received instruction in small groups. And they said, oh, it was the specific type of tutoring that caused the difference. When in fact, it had nothing to do with the tutoring. One was individual tutoring with an individual tutor with lots of feedback and a whole bunch of stuff. And another was in small group using prepackaged remedial stuff. It was designed to give them a result that was favorable to the group that they wanted to. As an example, this is what it was. My research question was, do blue cages cause mice to gain weight? And I said, yes, they do. Because we compared them and the blue cage mice were heavier and the yellow cage mice were skinnier at the end of this experiment. So if you want to lose weight, paint your house yellow. And you see the confounding variable here. These aren't equal groups. One was fed marshmallows, the other was fed salaries. In the studies Goldenberg cited, the type of metaphorical food given to the metaphorical mice were different. They claimed it was the color of cages that caused improved reading scores. Anyone with a 6th grade education could see that if you read the studies carefully. So 3 questions, which a controlled experimental research will not answer. Did Goldenberg not read the studies? Did he read the studies and not see the confounding variable? Or did he read the studies, see the anomaly, and make the citation anyway? I would like to know. Understanding research. And by the way, if state legislators were really serious about evidence-based practice for reading and research-based reading instruction, but they're not. If they were, every school district would have a subscription to the same kind of legitimate research database that I do as a university professor, and not What Works Clearinghouse. So, Eric, that's not legitimate. That's not legitimate. How do you expect teachers to make research-based decisions and evaluate evidence-based practice without research and evidence? And yet you blame them and you beat them up. That's not logical. That's not science. There's no such thing as the research. The research says, the research shows. I'm often asked this, show me the research. What does the research say? They demand of me the research. By the way, when anyone uses research in a declarative sentence, they must, in an academic setting, cite their research. You can't just say research says. There's no such thing as gravity, okay? There's no such thing as the research. There's no objective God. Oh, almighty research, we prayeth unto you, give us truth and enlightenment. There's no God who offers this objective view of reality. There's no such thing as the holy book called the research, where you can look up and say, the research says. Maybe they mean Thea research, a researcher named Thea research, and they're saying Thea research says. Maybe I should call my next book The Research. So you could say The Research says. Research involves science. Science uses research. It's a process of asking a question, collecting data, and using data to answer that question. The question up front is important. Louisa Moats tends to just collect data and then come to a conclusion. That's not research. What's the weather? Question. Look at the thermometer. Data. It's hot. Data to answer question. That's a basic of research. It's a systematic process used to collect and analyze data. Systematic means there's a fixed plan based on a set of principles that are generally agreed upon by the field. And the research method is a systematic process used to gather and analyze that data. That's important because there is no scientific method. There is no the method of science. There are methods of science. Controlled experimental research, the controlled experimental research is only one method of science. We must understand that conducting research in the physical sciences is a bit different from research in the social sciences. With human beings, we cannot control all the variables. We cannot put our children in giant petri dishes and give them similar conditions. That's not how it works. And research is not research unless and until it has been subjected to blind peer review and published in an academic journal. Here is the basic blind peer review process. This is why it's important. You do a study, you write it up, you submit the manuscript to an editor, and editors submits it to blind peer review. These are experts in their field. They don't know who the author of the article is. The author doesn't know who the reviewers are. They review that and they make a recommendation, either to reject, accept with revisions, or accept. There, and it's usually 2 to 5 reviewers. Their comments go to the editor, who then makes a decision based on their comments to accept, reject, or accept with revisions, and they work with the author. That's the process. Checks and balances, a filter. That's different from the process a journalist uses. People tell them things, they write a story, and they submit it to the editor, who approves or asks for revision. Much different. And the process used to put stuff on the internet. You think of stuff, you write it, and there you go. It's on the internet. Interesting article I recently analyzed. It's not research. These publications don't go through blind peer review. They just hire reporters to say stuff. American public media. Data is not research. Published reports are not research. White papers aren't research. Unpublished theses and dissertations do not go through blind peer review. Articles describing research are not research. Famous researchers aren't research. Secretaries of education aren't research. And anything on Lexia Learning website is not research. These are often used as if they were by people outside of academia, collecting data, citing white papers, think tanks, not research. Not research. Nonprofit does not mean non-biased. These are all think tanks that have things to say about education, but they all have an agenda. The two kinds of research, basic and applied, basic science and applied science. Basic is research that is done apart from the setting in which it's used, eye movement, brain imaging, miscue analysis. Applied research is done in the setting in which it will be used, in the classroom or learning environment. And controlled experimental research is used to isolate a variable to determine a causal relationship. This thing caused that to occur. Now, the science of reading research standard says only applied research using control and experimental groups can be used to make decisions about reading policies, products, and procedures, based on the mistaken assumption that you can isolate all the variables to determine universal causality and generalize that to all of humanity. That's a mistaken assumption. Research is not research unless it has been subjected to blind peer review. Research is different from collecting data. Data is not research. I could collect data to show that I am the greatest professor in the world, but that wouldn't be research. What's a good professor? What's a valid measure of a good professor? These are all things that I could collect. One of these, oh, look at my course evaluation. Oh, look at the number of YouTube views. That proves I'm a good professor. I highlight this because at our university, someone wanted to have metrics. I hate that term, metrics, to show that our College of Ed was doing a good job with teachers. So to get metrics, they found something that could be measured. And they went to the scores on the state teacher licensure exams that our students took. And they said, oh, look at the scores. Based on that, we're doing a good job. Well, that's not a valid measure. And here's the thing. If we spent the 3 semesters we have them just preparing them to take those tests, our scores would be out of this world. But we try to prepare them to do this thing called teach. Teach. Imagine that. A Massachusetts rep said, show me the data on queuing. The data, the data. Data is not research. Anybody can collect data. And here's the thing on cueing. Cueing is not a method or a approach. How's that? There's some data. The 3 cueing is not a method. It's not something you teach, and we'll talk about that later. Methods of science, the scientific method. There's no such thing as the method. A variety of research methods are used to study. And there's 2 groups, quantitative and qualitative. Let us understand the basics. Quantitative research, again, seeks to find that causal relationship, controls or manipulates reality to isolate a variable. You have a measure, you have 2 groups that are similar, you isolate one. The only difference is this treatment, and then you have a post-test. That is the basics. The difference must be statistically significant. That means it's greater than could occur by chance. Now, you don't need to understand statistics to understand statistical significance. If it's statistically significant at the 0.05 level, that means in less than 5% of the cases can we say that that difference was attributed to chance. In 95% of the cases, we can be confident that the difference between the 2 groups was caused by the variable. 0.05 is good, 0.01 is the best, but 0.05 is generally regarded as the standard. Controlled experimental research seeks to quantify reality. But here's the thing. By controlling all the variables to study reality, you make that bit of reality a bit of non-reality. You mess with the environment. It's not how it really is if you're controlling all the variables. Qualitative research seeks to study reality as it is. There's Jane Goodall studying apes in the wild, making notes. There's a variety of types of qualitative research. Here you see a professor in there taking notes. That helps us understand, that sees the people behind the numbers. By using only quantitative research, we are describing learning and human beings in numbers. But in 2002, the Education Science of a Reform Act said only quantitative research could be used. That's the only kind of research that would be funded. That's the only kind of knowledge that's valid. So a whole bunch of qualitative research that helped us understand the numbers was eliminated and slowly went away. It has to be experimental or quasi-experimental research, no qualitative research, no government funding. So it's not the use of controlled experimental research that's problematic. It's the exclusive use. You disallow us to see the people behind the numbers by disallowing a whole bunch of good qualitative research. And this is what the science of reading standards are. Strategies and practices that lead to improved outcomes, yes. Strategies and practices are supported by experimental or quasi-experimental research, establishes causal variables, and the research has been conducted in an authentic learning environment. The science of reading says they use strategies and practices that have been determined to be effective by these standards. Those are the standards. And I would be just fine with those standards if they were consistently applied. Now, here's an example of baloney. In Minnesota and Massachusetts, they recently passed legislation. They assumed there was a literacy crisis. They assumed teachers were teaching the wrong thing. And they assumed the problem was balanced literacy, and the answer was structured literacy. And the causal relationship was determined by anecdotal evidence. That's not science, people. That's not science. If you're going to be a science of reading, you have to be consistently scientific. The science of reading should not be given a free pass on non-scientific thinking. And these are two examples of things that are given a pass. Do these, has research shown that they lead to improved reading achievement or improved teacher ability to teach reading effectively? And have they been compared with something else? No single study provides irrefutable proof of anything. Research is a lot like sighting in your deer rifle. I grew up in a small town in a deer hunting culture, and every fall we would sight in our rifles to see if the rifle was shooting straight. The scope often got bumped over the winter, and we wouldn't take a single shot. We would take a lot of shots to give us a sense of where the scope was shooting, because we could have wiggled, or there could have been something that happened with the table that gave us an extreme shot. By taking many shots, we get a sense of where the scope is shooting, and then we adjust our scope. But even then, if we're pretty certain of where it's shooting, even though we start walking in the woods, it's the person behind the scope that determines where the bullet lands, and a bunch of other variables. No single study. Research is like that. We can't find one study and says, oh, that proves that. That's not how research works. Research does not prove or debunk. And by the way, whole language has not been debunked. Yes, there's been people that say it's been debunked. In the name of almighty research, I debunked you, be debunked you. It hasn't been debunked. Just because people say that, okay, well, I could debunk things. I could debunk the theory of gravity. There it is. It's been debunked. I debunked it. And here's my proof. You can't just go around debunking things. Research answers a specific research question. Research proves or disproves a hypothesis. And we have to be wary of research that doesn't have a specific research question or purpose. And that is true of Louisa Motz's stuff. Can't use the word proven with science. Observations are never perfect. Interpretations are never perfect. Truth needs a context, and information is often complete. Scientists rarely use that word. Here's an example. Phonics instruction is good for increasing phonics skills. Absolutely. You teach a bunch of phonics and students are going to score higher on phonics measures. Absolutely. Absolutely, phonics instruction has shown to be more effective in raising scores on measures of phonics than no phonics instruction. Absolutely. But that does not prove that all students need lots of phonics instruction. Something can be technically true and conveniently inaccurate at the same time. This idea that phonics should be the center of reading instruction, that is based on a lot of I thinkisms. This does not mean all students need heavy doses of phonics, or students would be better readers if they get more phonics, or more phonics is better than less phonics, or phonics is the key variable in learning to read. Anything other than phonics instruction should be excluded. And phonics should be taught at all ages and levels. Phonics skills transfer to authentic reading situations. These are all assumptions. And these research is based on the assumption that reading is sounding out words. Research based on sounding out words focuses on sounding out words and includes sounding out word measures. If you ask sounder out questions, you use sounder out measures, you collect sounder out data, you are going to make sounder out conclusions. That's what science of reading research is. Research is not collecting a bunch of data and saying stuff. Research must be based on a specific question or hypothesis. When you read a research study, after the abstract, the first thing you should look for is that research question. And research always focuses on a specific group at a specific location doing a specific task. That's why we can't use one study. For example, what works with a first grade student in Blackwater, Arizona, struggling with word recognition may not work with a fifth grader in Edina, Minnesota, struggling with comprehension. Human beings are not standardized products. Readers are not standardized products. Students are not standardized products. Again, when you read the research, skip the literature, look for the question. And these are the big three. All right, I have seen that this is 60 minutes. I am going to stop my presentation here. I will host this presentation on my Substack, the Reading Instruction Show, and I will post the rest of this. Those who are still here, I thank you for listening. I am Andy Johnson.